Welcome once again to The Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City, and I'm here with my co-host, the philosopher Michael Pelias. All this month, we're commemorating the first anniversary of the show. We're so thrilled and grateful to have one of the major forces and visionaries behind the creation of the show, who appeared with Cornel West on our very first show a year ago. He's been involved in movement struggle his entire life. As one of those original red diaper babies, his lifelong work has been to create the kind of left he believes America needs, which would include launching a comprehensive education program and opening up a conversation about the creation of a new left political formation that would be anti-capitalist and independent of the Democrats. He's been involved in the various twists and turns of the left over the last 6 decades as he remained true to reviving the radical imagination. He's a distinguished professor of sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center and is truly an original. Michael and I are so happy to have him here to discuss the campaign, the future of a real progressive movement as he sees it, and the left turn he would want us and America to take. As he puts it, there are many leftists, but no left. With that intriguing phrase, let me welcome Stanley Aronowitz to the Radical Imagination. Hi, Stanley.
Hi.
So great to have you here. Hi, Michael.
How you doing, Jim?
Great, great.
I might want to put up the first two of Stanley's books that actually talk about new movements.
And you didn't bring the other 24,
I didn't bring
though.
the other 24
okay, that's another
with me,
show.
or 25.
Right.
But anyway, Left Turn, of course, which we did some analysis of 2 weeks ago.
We did.
Forging a New Political Future that was done in 2006, Paradigm Publishers, and we'll talk somewhat about that. And also The Death and Life of American Labor, which is Stanley's most recent book from Verso that has already caused a lot of controversy within study groups, labor unions, etc. In fact, over 500 copies were ordered by one union in Pennsylvania to study. So it's been a very good seller for Verso as well, and very interesting in terms of trying to think through the labor question towards a new workers' movement.
But let's start with that intriguing phrase. We'll get to all of this.
Right.
No left? Many leftists? What
Many
do you mean
leftists.
Many leftists, but no left.
Who are ready to march, who are ready to demonstrate, who are ready to sit in, who are ready to raise their voices on issues. But what we do not have, and we haven't had it really since the relatively large Communist Party of the 1940s, is we don't have a party. Now, even the small parties that criticize the communists, like the Socialist Workers' Party and the Socialist Party, which was in the process of almost disappearing in the 40s, oriented themselves to the mistakes of the communists. But now we haven't, all we have are very small groups. We have a movement, social movement, which is very amorphous and appears and disappears and makes noise and relapses into silence in the Black freedom movement, in even the labor movement, in the feminist movement, but we don't have what a real left would be.
A continuous formation.
Continuous formation,
right.
Which I call, following not Karl Marx in this case, but following Thomas Jefferson and Marx and Engels, a party. We don't have a party. There are people who say, no, but I'm an anarchist. I don't believe in parties. That is not the way that either Marx or Jefferson used the term party. What they meant by party is organized groups, organized formations that had a vision of both the present and the future and a sharp analysis of the past from which they derived. We don't have that now. We have individuals with no social, political formation. And the reason we don't have that social and political formation is complex. The reasons are complex, one of which has been the failure, the abject failure of the Communist Party and the disappearance of the Socialist Party, which at the end became nothing but essentially a debating society. At the end of its thousands of members, it now exists and it does participate. But those parties did not serve us well, except at the local level where they did some sterling work, both of them. The second reason that we don't have left is because the last attempt to create a left, which was by the Students for a Democratic Society, which morphed imperfectly into the Movement for a Democratic Society, gave up. As people started to go into their careers after college and graduate school, they settled back into academic berths or into a commercial life or into a nonprofit community organizing and gave up the idea of a democratic, radical democratic society. Not that they didn't personally hold to it, but they did not believe any longer that it was possible to organize around it, to actually create a continuous, as you said before, a continuous movement that could intervene and also not only on issues, but also provide a broad and comprehensive analysis of where we are and what things mean, both political and social. And that was a terrible thing, and that took place roughly in 1970 and 71. After which, groups tried, and they ended in most cases, if they survived, into very small, either magazines or basically bookstores with some
academic
activists.
programs, creation of small
Departments
academic programs and departments. So
And you see Black Lives Matter as another manifestation of
I think Black
movement
Lives
of the
Matter is a movement phenomenon, which should be supported 100%,
Absolutely.
to use a quantitative equation.
as a
But
movement.
As a
phenomenon.
movement phenomenon. But I think to mistake the movement for the party is to give up the second element of what a real political formation would consist of. It consists of daily, weekly, or even to begin with monthly newspapers, radio programs, television programs all over the country, not only in Manhattan, but everywhere.
Lifelong
like this one.
commitments.
Lifelong commitments
Yeah.
would be a good way of putting it. Now, one thing you did in your introduction to me that I want to, it's a small correction.
All right. The red diaper?
I am not a red diaper.
All right, I'm sorry. I thought,
My parents, I would
okay.
say, my
It sounds-
parents
yeah.
ideologically were LaGuardia progressives
Oh, boy, okay.
with some socialist leanings, but never belonged to a political organization. The red diaper babies were basically the children of organized Reds, mostly communists, and I didn't have that background.
I
Although-
imagine you do. Maybe I fantasized that you had, so. That's another bubble I'm just going to have to burst.
Well,
All
that may
right.
have helped him in its critical acumen.
Yeah, it's all right.
Going
But what
forward,
is
right?
also true
Yes.
is that I became a teenage radical. We organized a branch of the Young Progressives of America at Music and Art High School that I attended, and we had 250 members. And we made a lot of difference in the high school about issues affecting teachers' pay and unionization of teachers. And the Young Progressives were really a branch of the Wallace movement, which was called the Progressive Party.
Right.
That was my first real introduction into radical politics as an activist and as an organizer.
This is when now, the late 40s?
40s, late 40s,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
Wallace is the key
Yeah,
there, of
sure,
course.
yeah,
right,
the
right.
40s.
Well, Wallace is not the key.
Well, okay.
No, it was still the Communist Party in the
Right,
late 40s, Wallace was willing to work with the Communist Party because he was for Big Three unity rather than the Cold War, which was a very unusual and very radical stance of that moment. He was convinced that the Cold War would paralyze the peace effort, the effort to a rebuilding of what we called at the time third world societies, as
Which
well
he's
as
corrected.
the removal of the United States and the Soviet Union from the war economy. He was 100% against the war economy.
Right.
So that was what the progressives stood for. They didn't do all that well, partly because they were basically shut out from the media. They did not really have a viable, outside of some big states like New York, Illinois, and California, and a few others, Minnesota. They did not have a street strategy to organize people around everyday issues. And the second major problem they had is that they didn't have the support of those on their left who were mainly Trotskyists and anarchists. They were, in many ways, victims of a sectarianism which afflicted the left in that period, especially the Communist Party.
And just a brief little update. Now, what would you say about the Green Party? We've had Jill Stein on, Jamu Baraka on the show, and you've run on that party too. But this is not what you're looking. You're not really addressing.
I would vote
them,
Green
are
in
you?
this
You
election,
would,
but I
okay.
do not.
This is not quite what you're talking about in terms
No,
of
I
alternative
ran as Green Party
formation.
candidate for governor of New York State in 2002, but
Okay.
I would not describe the Green Party as that political formation which really offers an alternative vision as well as an alternative program. It sounds very much like an updated New Deal, just as Bernie Sanders did, in my opinion. They are for good policies like single payer, health care. They are for end of discrimination. They raise imperfectly the issues of blacks.
The environment.
And the environment. Well, you know, Jill Stein doesn't do even very much about the environment. My view is that the Green Party, to a large extent, has become another social justice political organization, but doesn't really have an ecological perspective as the heart of its program. It is really, in many ways, a left liberal program. It's not for socialism or anything approaching what socialism might look like in this country. It, like Bernie, seems to accept, and I don't think they individually accept, but I think as a party, they're not articulating an alternative social, historically situated social formation. And for that reason, they can't grow. They can only intervene. Now and this is the 19th of October, they probably can get 3% of the vote, which is what Ralph Nader got in 2000, because the disaffection with both the Democrats and less so the Republicans, but the disaffection of the Democrats by a lot of young people are going to build their amount on the one hand. On the other hand, however, those people who will vote Green are not voting for an alternative, they're voting for a protest. And I think the Green Party has never transcended protest politics.
Understood.
Just returning
go
for
ahead,
a
sure.
second to what Stanley mentioned in the 70s, what happened. Another thing that was abandoned that he makes a very good point of in Left Turn is that the revolutionary horizon of utopic thinking was abandoned, was completely left out. You know, we don't really have that speculation operative, as he just mentioned. You know, the Green Party is a protest vote. The Sandinista
The age of
movement.
Aquarius.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Let me
Yeah,
give
this
you
is
an
good.
example.
Yeah.
Right.
1848 January, two intellectuals in Germany, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, write a pamphlet called the Manifesto of the Communist Party. And the manifesto begins, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." That is not a factual statement. That is a statement of utopian thought. which of course in the long run proved to be all true, but in the short run only had a possibility that
Wishful
would have
thinking.
materialized if there had been a movement that was willing to support the specter of
Well, a
communism.
fiction. It was a fiction.
Yes.
I don't think it was only wishful. It
And-
was a
no.
fiction that became,
Yeah.
something.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So this is what we need more. That sort
Sure.
of idealism, that
Yeah.
sort of vision, if you will, radical imagination.
Well, the first
right?
thing we have to have is a conversation of what
Exactly.
that vision would look
What
like.
would it look like?
Which is what we're having.
I'm
yeah.
not talking about one person
Right.
coming forward and providing that kind of imagination. In
Exactly.
fact, Marx and Engels, especially Marx, who was a very active member of the labor movement when he moved from Germany, when he got kicked out of Germany and landed in London, Marx, who was a very active member of the International Working Men's Association, was in the minority in that association. The majority followed a variety of groups, especially the Proudhon, who was a guild socialist who believed that socialism would be essentially a movement that would, a state of society which would be based on small manufacturing, and Marx opposed that. But he had something else, which is that he had sharply analytic tools to understand where the movement was at that moment and where it had been. He was a historically sophisticated figure. He also was a philosopher. He also was a sociologist, as we would understand it now. And he was a political thinker. Those combinations in one person, including Engels, are absent today. Today we are a society consists of people with specialties. I'm a specialist in philosophy. That's not true of Michael Pelias. I'm a specialist in political science. I'm a specialist in sociology, psychology, anthropology, geography. And that specialization was antithetical to their view. The vision, the utopian but also analytic vision, has to basically attempt to create ideas about the totality, and not to take politics as a specialty, not to take sociology as a specialty, but to understand their interrelationship, to understand how people live. And as Henri Lefebvre, a French philosopher and sociologist, has argued, it has to be how people live in their everyday lives. Lefebvre argued that everyday life was, in many ways, the most important possibility, as well as the most important obstacle to the possibility of change. If people get habituated to a certain way of thinking, a certain way of doing, of buying, of eating, of living, of thinking that jobs are so necessary that to attack alienated labor, that is, to attack jobs as they currently exist, is almost a sin, then we're not going anywhere.
And also this failure to think comprehensively, or to
Right.
think in terms of a totality of involvements and totality of ideas, and try to look at the interconnections, has also been abandoned by the single issue movements, by single
Identity
movements.
politics.
So there's Black Lives Matter.
Identity movements,
and
Michael.
identity movements
Yeah,
in
identity
particular.
movements, right.
Yeah.
Not seeing the links between militarism and ecological
Right.
disaster
Exactly.
and racism. And so there are, other than yourself, I mean, are there other thinkers, writers that you're reading that we could learn from, or that you are attracted to?
I mean,
Today.
I mentioned Henri Lefebvre, Lefebvre. Lefebvre has written a book has written 3 volumes called The Critique of Everyday Life, a book called The Production of Space, a book called Everyday Life in the Modern World. He died in 1991 and was really, in many ways, one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century. I would also say that Jean-Paul Sartre, the later Jean-Paul Sartre, in his Critique of Dialectical Reason, would be one other person who has some kind of a vision of how things change. In the United States, we have very good thinkers. We have Mike Davis, who writes about cities and writes about poverty and does it brilliantly. We had the legacy of William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, whose books inspired to this day, especially his idea of the double consciousness that he thinks blacks possess. On the one hand, they're Americans, on the other hand, they're blacks. Yeah. And he writes this in 1903, when blacks were virtually excluded from citizenship, even if they were called free. We now have a revival of that concept by Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely.
But we don't have a literature to pass down the same kind of literature. Although also in the modern world and the modern lives, the late James Baldwin is worth reading. Richard Wright is worth reading. We need to look at these people again.
How about some of the women?
Well,
As you haven't mentioned.
I think that's very good. Shulamith Firestone has written the manifesto for the radical feminist movement in the United States, and I think there were other people, some of whom write today, that are worth talking about, and even then.
Familiar with Michelle Alexander, for example?
Yeah, Michelle Alexander.
She's beginning to make links between all kinds
she's
of
beginning to make links
forces,
as well.
Mass incarceration, militarism. Again, she's going to be at Union now as a professor there, so she's including in that analysis the spiritual, progressive.
I'm glad you raised that.
I wanted to. We talked about it before, and I'd like your opinion on. Is
my-
that a necessary component
my opinion
of
is
all of this?
That the spiritual is not essentially an ideology.
Okay.
It's not an ideology invented by religion to deny the existence of the world, although some religionists actually, as well as idealist philosophers, use it that way. The spiritual, as Spinoza taught us, is really of the world. We have not spiritualism as an ideology, but we have spirit, we have sort of a living utopia because the world embraces it, it gets papered over, it gets mediated by false consciousness, by ideology. But essentially, spirit is for us to recapture. And Michelle Alexander is one of those people who had it.
What does that mean now, again, to recapture?
Well, recapture
What
is
do you mean by
because
that?
somebody like Shirley Firestone, 1970, who wrote The Dialectic of Sex, who argued that sexuality was part and parcel of the political process and that had been ignored by a left, and that there was a feminist historical materialism that she outlined, that she has been virtually forgotten. I also have to mention another name of somebody who died in 2006, who happened to be my partner, and later my wife. We married after 17 years of living without marriage, Ellen Willis. And there are
was
many.
also a good friend of Firestone's and part of the movement.
More
the
than a
Red
good
Stockings,
friend.
yes.
She
Like
thought
this.
Shirley. She
Like-
thought Shirley had outlined the task for a new feminism
right.
for years to come. What Shirley tried to argue was that, who's also no longer with us, is that women are a class, and that classes are not basically alone founded on ownership and property, but that classes are about movements that change society. So that, for the sake of illustration, blacks can be a class and became a class. Workers became a class, but they disappear. They don't necessarily stay alive forever. The unions today are essentially bureaucratic institutions that at best take care of people's health care with minimum cost. But they've lost their sense of mission. And surely Firestone had mission, and William Edward Burghardt Du Bois had a sense of mission.
Life energy, that this
Yes.
encapsulated one's life. It wasn't just a
that's
part of
right.
one's life, it wasn't a
But
career.
that's right.
so
The
on.
notion that came down from the black movement from Frederick Douglass on was that blacks have been, in the words of some, deracinated in American society. And as long as the whites tolerate deracination, that is to say that they have been rendered invisible except as evil, they've lost their names. As long as that we have a deracination of blacks, or deracination of women, or deracination of anybody, then we cannot have any aspiration for freedom, which is the heart, in my opinion, of the radical imagination. It's what we're really looking for is what the right has appropriated, which is freedom. One of the reasons that Donald Trump
That's right.
has now maybe a third of the electorate solid, maybe he's got more than 40%, is because he speaks in racist terms and sexist terms in ugly ways, but he also speaks of freedom. He speaks about the deprivation that the system has visited upon large numbers of working people.
It connects at that level, absolutely.
And he connects to a certain percentage of them. Now, it's very difficult to believe. It's possible that he will simply, if he loses, disappear and go back into his golf courses and hotels. I believe
Ain't gonna happen.
he is giving birth to a new right in the United States, which is no longer the right wing of like the Republican Party,
Right.
but it is an aggressive, totalitarian right, and it gets support because he articulates what a lot of workers feel, a lot of people generally feel, which is that they're not getting it. That
It's no longer a false promise, it's a stolen promise.
It's a stolen promise.
Right.
And that the big boys in Wall Street, of which he's a part, but the big boys in Wall Street are appropriating or taking all of the riches and all of the wealth of this society.
So he's creating, on the right, the new formation, a new formation you're talking about that the left needs to do.
That's right.
And
Now,
we're lagging behind on that.
Hillary
as
Clinton
well.
defends the status quo.
Right.
And many people who are terrified of this new right are going to vote for Clinton rather than voting for Jill Stein, whose promise is that she wants to do something different, although it's not that different. And you can understand why she has such mileage. Hillary Clinton has mileage because Trump has raised the stakes of what it means to be president of the United States badly, but he's raised the stakes. And he appears to be a defender of the working class.
Right. And she's fully symbolic with finance
That's right.
capital.
That's correct.
Right, whereas his symbolism is more about the rentier class, the casino capitalism, which actually plays, I think, much more to the working class. I may hit the lottery.
The
I
freedom
may
to
hit
make
the
a
stock,
billions,
to
right,
make
which
the
is
freedom to make the
make the
money,
billions,
right?
right.
You know,
And I'll also have a mortgage to a bank.
right.
Or to a insurance company, or to a finance company that will protect me, finally. None of which is true. 4 million plus people lost their homes in 2008 and 2009. The federal government under Republicans and the Democrats did very, very little to restore many people to their homes. They had to leave.
The Dobbs-Frank bill, which
That's
is
right.
basically kid gloves in
And
terms
don't
of
forget
minor
Katrina.
regulation. Right? Yeah.
What Bush did at Katrina is that he continued to read fairy tales to children as the bomb hit the World Trade Center. But as Katrina happened, all they could think of is relocating people out of New Orleans and never providing for their relocation back to their homes. And the Obama administration has done very little to reverse that, if anything at all. And I think that's probably what you can expect from Hillary Clinton.
Exactly. Just one more point on this, and some possibilities of contemporary movements that perhaps could offer options of the alternative forms you're talking about. We talked before the show, Reverend William Barber's movement.
Sure.
Moral Mondays, who you've said you have certain admiration for,
No, I
integrity
not a
and so
certain
on.
admiration. I admire Barber.
I do too, very much. I'm sure Michael does.
I admire what
But
he's
where
doing.
can this go? And yes, how can he become part of this new formation you're talking about? Or can
First
he?
thing, there has to be a formation proposal that he's invited to participate in and see how he feels about it.
Okay. Well, we'll invite him. I think
Yeah.
The
he's
formation cannot be a formation that a group of people sit around a table and decide to do. It has to come out of the confluence of
Organic
myriad struggles.
struggles, yes.
A certain repudiation of identity politics and sectarianism.
Uh-huh.
And it has to be a formation which argues, which I would argue, that you can't have liberation or freedom under capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is not a system which is based on equality.
Impossible.
Impossible.
Okay.
It has to be a new system, and it has to be fought for continuously, even between generations, and maybe not even two generations. It has to be something that we carry with us, like Christianity carries with them since the death of Jesus Christ over 2,000 years ago. This cannot be a movement which says alone, although it should say that as well, we want to improve our lives now. That's terribly important.
Yeah.
But it has to be a movement which says, we're going to worry about our grandchildren. We're going to worry about our great-grandchildren. I have grandchildren. I have 2 great-grandchildren. I'm worried about them. I read a lot about the environment, and anywhere from 25 years to 75 years of this environment, we're going to be
That's it.
a planet without life.
Mm-hmm.
We may be underwater here in Manhattan in that period. And the conversation doesn't even get close to it.
Of course, Lower
Barbara
Manhattan will have the
What'd you say?
walls. Lower Manhattan will be somewhat protected, but you're right that eventually the water will
Sure.
take over those walls too. But yeah, we understand.
Yeah.
So, but Barber's movement here, expanding it, again, the possibilities of that becoming something more than it is now. He does speak in terms of universal language and reaching across to other peoples who are
Well, for him to have
suffering as
significant
well.
partners, those people who would reach out to him would have to create the conditions for an exchange of ideas as well as a power of equals. Right now, we don't have that.
certainly not in the universities.
Not only in the
Like-
university. No.
Michael knows too.
I can name you the half-dozen places in the labor movement that something is going on. Nothing as solid as Moral Mondays.
Name those. Name a few for us, for our audience.
Well, the Amalgamated Transit Union has been making some very aggressive efforts to improve the conditions of transit workers and are taking a much more radical stance towards politics, at least at the national level. The American Nurses Association and the California Nurses Association in particular are really in many ways, although they supported burning, they're really alternative institutions who have built real movements to improve the lives not only of their own members but to change the health system in California. and some places around the world. We have a Teamster local in Chicago, which is a very progressive local. It's a very, very interesting local. We have a wonderful Chicago teachers organization, comparatively, and now Los Angeles has been won by a rank and file teacher organization. We'll see how well it does, but it looks like it wants to be different.
And which is very interesting that they're not interested only in wage
That's correct.
packages. They're interested in the quality of the curriculum and taking back some autonomy for the teachers, which is something we have not really experienced. As you know, we spoke about LIU and the lockout there. You know, most of our rank and file in the union are not interested in transforming the institution. You know, this is part of what has happened. You know,
they don't have any hope that it can be done.
No hope in it, exactly. That's another thing. That
Criminal
horizon.
justice, anything that you see in the horizon in criminal justice? And
Well, yes,
attempt to
I
end
do.
mass incarceration, some of Jim Gilligan's work,
Yes.
idea of punishment.
I also see a broad scale change in attitudes towards capital punishment. There are a little less than half a dozen states which have abolished capital punishment. There's the Innocence Project, which is fighting as an institutional struggle against capital punishment, which is a consortium of lawyers which stays with it. We also have a beginning of a movement which is not yet materialized organizationally against incarceration. It was once the case that Angela Davis and a few others would fight against incarceration of people who committed so-called crimes, which were nonviolent. And they were regarded as curiosity, sometimes admirably, most of the times with contempt or with laughter. Now that notion is no longer a quizzical notion. It is now making its way into the center of the debate about criminal justice, which is very important. But see, I think those efforts on criminal justice are fragile without the backing of a party, of a political force that can stay the slings and arrows of outrageous force.
To quote somebody.
We need some muscle to
Yeah,
fight the Corrections
that's-
Corporation of
that's
America.
That's right.
What are you working on these days, Stanley? Who are you reading? What are you thinking about? Who's influencing you?
I'm reading a book that by this guy. I think he wrote a book called "How We Should Get Ready for Death."
Yeah.
Do you know the name of the book? Put out by City Lights. He makes an argument. It says
On the Anthropocene? Is that?
yeah, what is it called?
Yeah, I forgot. I think in the title is the Anthropocene.
Anthropocene.
Which is a
Getting ready
new
for
concept out there.
the
One of our
Anthropocene.
new,
And what he says
models
is
of
it's too late
ecological. Too late. Yeah.
for reversing global warming. And what he's trying to do is develop an alternative that's, on the one hand, more realistic and can help change global warming, or at least slow it down. It's too late for
The sort of transformative
Fundamental
change.
reversal.
for windmills
For windmills.
Windmills.
and all that,
Solar.
and hydro.
Hydro.
Yeah, to be able to reverse global warming, we have to find new solutions that are more economical. He mentions carbon capturing, that you capture from the coal. It's it's carbon dioxide. He mentions a few other. I haven't finished. You asked me what I'm reading. I'm reading extensively, I must say, into the environmental and ecological literature. But one of the most interesting parts of it is findings that I've had is that almost none of them, except this book that I can tell, has a realistic notion of what a solution would look like, but is still at the level of pointing out how disastrous our current policies of toxins being spewed into the air because of oil and coal. They're still at that level.
Mm-hmm.
This guy goes beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also I'm reading about the history of the Supreme Court over the last 45 or 50 years since Brown v. Board of Education and the fights that they have had, both about issues affecting women and blacks, as well as issues such as capital punishment, which are largely against blacks, but also against others. And there are some very interesting books about it. Linda Greenhouse and her collaborator have a new book about it. And this guy from John Jay College in the sociology department has a book about capital punishment. And I forget his name. I'm not, I wouldn't, if I knew I was going to have to recite it, I probably would have just opened the book. I've read both of those books pretty carefully. Mm-hmm. And it's about how the Supreme Court works. We have to learn how the Supreme Court works. I grew up believing that the Supreme Court and the criminal justice system were institutionalizations of my enemy. I didn't have to know anything about them to know to run. And if you look at Amy Goodman's program, Democracy Now!, she still has that attitude. Mm-hmm. And it's very useful. Last night, I watched the protagonists of the fight against the pipeline from North Dakota. The Native Americans talk about how they have been screwed over. But there's no analytic work that's coming out of those sources. The analytic work is going on to a large extent in briefs and amicus briefs by, historically, by the NAACP's legal project, which was imperfect, but it was much more interesting than the NAACP at that time, by people fighting the death penalty, etc. But that stuff, generally speaking, does not get into print, or it gets into print only in very narrow
circles.
And we have very little work on the philosophy of law, law on the left. We're very, very little, a very underdeveloped, almost completely neglected field. And now I think what Stanley's trying to point to is
it was always more or less neglected on the left as well.
Right.
Pashukanis,
right.
and a few others.
Yes,
that's about it.
That's right.
Brenda.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tigar, the book on
Michael Tiger.
Right.
His book, Law and the Rise of Capitalism, is a very useful book. But
introduction, sort of.
But it is not philosophically profound.
Right. That's right.
We've got still a few minutes to go, but I wanted to just ask you a quick question on, since this has been one of your many, many projects, the Left Forum, and I know you've seen it go through all kinds of stages and conflicts and so on. Is this, what do you perceive its function really to be?
The Left Forum has been around for 10 years.
Okay.
And it's grown every year except last year to nearly 4,000 people.
Right.
It still has not fulfilled what I call a project. A project would be to raise the issues sharply, either in its plenaries or in special panels, raise the issues facing the American left.
Right.
It acts as if it's a essentially a
Celebration and
a
gathering.
circus,
Gathering,
a
social
celebration of what there is on the
Right,
left.
right.
What there is on the left is much, much too disjointed and fragmented, just like the rest of the society,
right.
to justify a left form. So I think we're going to get involved. I'm on the board of the left form. I think we're going to get involved in defining what those issues might be. One of them might be the criminal justice system.
Uh-huh.
One of them might be how we integrate issues of feminism, of black and Latino freedom, and class, and issues of class. One of them is to understand what casino capitalism means. Another one is to understand what it means, what that finance capitalism with derivatives and hedge funds have done to the lives of ordinary people.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd have to have different people than we've had before.
Right.
Most of the left icons are good people, but they tend to repeat themselves. And they tend to work in slogans. And what we need to do is get beyond that. It may not be popular among the constituency of the left form, but it has to be that the left form has projects that point towards a future which will do what we just talked about during this this hour.
Mm-hmm.
That is to talk about people's need for a full-time party, to talk about what the constituents of that party might be, and how you integrate the fragments, the specificities, if you want to be more general, with the notion of a totality, of an analysis and a program of the totality.
I think the majority of people who attend the left forum would be interested in that sort of
Not if we brought to the plenaries and to the major panels people whose names are not that well known.
Mm-hmm.
We'd still have a problem of attendance in those places.
Okay.
I don't mind that. Eventually somebody's got to say, look, we've had enough of the icons.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the issue is to bring thought back to the
Right.
left, right? Not only activity, but the relationship between thinking and activity. And one of the definers of the radical imagination, Cornelius Castilloradas, who actually uses the term often in the early 60s, said, we can't take power, so we need to think. And you know, he said this in 1962. By 1968, we had May of '68. Not that it was a direct correlation to what Castilloradas said, but there is something to be said for preparatory, propedeutic, engagement, so that we don't make the same mistakes.
And 1968 was also the birth in the United States of a very vigorous right-wing movement.
Right, of course, yes.
At the same time as you had Chicago and a very active left, you
George
had the
Wallace.
beginning of a major rise. What?
George Wallace.
Well, George Wallace was certainly an important part of it, but it went all the way up
And Nixon.
to the Supreme Court. It went up to the White House.
Yes.
How could it be that a Richard Nixon got elected president of the United States?
And speaking of that, we only literally have a couple of minutes. What I'm
Twice.
so sorry.
He ran 3 times, but he
Yeah.
was elected twice.
Right. But
That's true.
what do you, what's your take on the election? What do you think is going to happen?
I think Hillary Clinton will sneak in.
Sneak
I
in.
think within a year.
Big win? Decisive?
She will win.
Should win, but big margin or 3
I think
points?
it could be big, but I think if it's not big, it's going to be substantial enough for her to take office and to have a mandate. She has no mandate.
Right.
She has not defined her campaign as a campaign seeking a mandate. As a result of which, it will be easy for her to slip into neoliberal, meaning free market, which is a fiction, free market politics, and accommodation with Wall Street. If she does that, the question that I have in my own head is whether it will be tolerated, whether this is going to result in a accelerated movement towards a left political formation. and a progressive political formation, which would be an electoral formation primarily. I'm not sure that that will happen, but I'm sure that that will be what Clinton will do. She's not going to become, unless there's a big movement below, she's not going to become the herald of our
The left.
Yeah. And does she
among
function
the-
as a neutralizer completely of all the energy that was out there in the Sanders campaign, somewhat in the Green Party, but mostly in the Sanders campaign? What happens to this? Does this go to the level of apathy, cynicism? You know, we've witnessed this after the Obama upsurge in 2008. What
And much
happened
perhaps
in the different-
depends on what happens with Trump,
Yes,
too,
right.
in terms of
Yes,
the
I think he has
reaction.
a much better chance in terms of building a, quote, radical right movement.
and being the size to do it himself.
Right, right.
Well, that's
Yeah.
right.
We'll see.
Well,
We'll
the
see.
left needs
Right
to,
now, we need, we can say this. Yeah.
We can say this, right? Well, listen, this has been absolutely terrific. Stanley, really love you very, very much. And thank you so much. Look,
Good to have ideas on
and
the
Michael,
program. Huh?
thank absolutely. And look, this show, we wouldn't be all sitting here without Stanley. Stanley's vision and
Sure.
his courage and his humanness, and we're just so thankful for you and your guidance and your sage words for the left, and we will continue this discussion next week. Thank you again so very, very much. We're going to have Rick Wolf on again next week, so we will see you.
Who actually co-authored part of, Stanley authored most of it, and Rick and I contributed, Manifesto for a Left Turn that came out in 2008 before the Obama election, in which there was a critique of.
And we'll
Anyway,
we'll
that's
talk
back
about that.
Back before Rick has all of his TV
Has become
programs and has
mogul,
become
this
mogul
this
celebrity.
mogul in the left.
Right, exactly.
We're getting the word here. We need to get going here.
Good.
So thank you again so very, very much. We'll see you again next week. This is Jim Vrettos on The Radical Imagination.
These illegal drugs in terms of the public education has just been lies. The fact is, what we know is that there are positive effects associated with people using a drug like crack.
And I got involved with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers by attending their weekly meetings and their other gatherings that they have in the community of Immokalee, which is made up of workers that pick all sorts of crops that are grown in Southwest Florida, from tomatoes, oranges, cucumbers, and other things.
Mars show or whatever, that religion is a belief in some kind of magical super being who sits on a cloud or sits somewhere and takes worries about whether you've fornicated and if you're good and ask him for things you'll get. I mean, it's this kind of child's version.
By simply high taxation on the rich. In order to have genuine high taxation on the rich, a very big step would be to go back to the Eisenhower years when the was 91%. Right, yeah.
Okay.
So that would be a big step. And they would still have...
But still not what you're talking about here in terms of an
no, but I
alternative
want to
vision.
be clear that
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not talking about...
We want to make that clear,
I'm talking about a practical utopia. I'm not talking about a nostalgic utopia.
Okay.
What we need is a serious address to whether or not people can any longer make a living and live peacefully under the system. And
distant you are from the realities of the problems, the more somehow deep and profound your scholarship, which is, far from the truth. The reality is that the whole reason for education, the whole reason for theory, the whole reason for scholarship is to resolve and improve life.
Vigorous state action for that to happen.
Absolutely.
And stepping on a lot of toes
Yeah.
to get there.
Right.
And she is certainly not the one to do that. And I thought for half a minute that maybe Obama might step in that direction. There's some half-decent stuff in the first stimulus bill, and that was the end of it.
Right, right.
And he's done a couple of things on environmental regulations in the last year or so that, okay. But,
Agree with what they're saying. I have to say that Black Lives Matter is a decentralized structure, and it's got state sanctions, right? We are operating state by state. and we understand what needs to be changed in our states, but we have this ideology, this common ideology, and we are also invested in nonviolence.
Show of the Radical Imagination. I am so happy to have had you here.